Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, stands as an imposing sentinel above the world, casting its shadow over the Tibetan Plateau to the north and Nepal to the south. The landscape is vast, seemingly endless, a realm of rock, snow, and ice that stretches far beyond the horizon. Its towering, jagged peaks pierce the sky, and its frozen slopes are as unforgiving as they are beautiful. The air, thin and sharp, carries a biting chill that nips at the skin, and the only sounds are the howling winds and the soft crunch of snow beneath the feet of those who dare to scale its heights. On May 10, 1996, the weather around Everest was still, the sky clear and blue, offering a rare window of calm. As climbers ascended the final stretch toward the summit, the mountains seemed deceptively serene. From their vantage points, they could look out over the vast expanse below, an awe-inspiring view that reminded them why they had come here in the first place. But above 26,000 feet, the so-called death zone, the conditions are extreme, and the challenges of Everest become brutally real. Seaborn Beck Weathers, an experienced mountaineer from Texas, was part of a guided team led by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants. His ascent had not been without its struggles. He had recently undergone radial keratotomy surgery, and his vision, once clear, was now compromised by the high altitude. Weathers had hoped that his eyesight would improve with time, but as he climbed higher, it became apparent that this was not the case. The thin air made every step more difficult, and as the group pressed on toward the summit, it became clear that the challenges would soon intensify. But for now, the mountain was calm, the sky clear, and the climbers pushed onward, unaware of the storm that would soon descend on them, changing everything. Seaborn Beck Weathers was no stranger to mountains. Born in 1946, he had spent much of his adult life battling depression. He had sought solace in physical activity, and over time mountaineering became his way of confronting the darkness that loomed over him. His pursuit of the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each of the 7 continents, was not just a challenge for the body, but an attempt to overcome a mental struggle that had defined much of his life. Climbing provided a way to push his body beyond its limits, forcing him to stop thinking, to stop feeling, if only for a moment. This was his escape. Before Everest, Weathers had already conquered other major climbs, including those in Alaska and South America. He was an experienced climber, and the physical challenges of mountaineering were familiar to him. However, Everest presented something different. At nearly 29,000 feet, it was the highest peak in the world, and it demanded more than physical strength. It required mental fortitude and the ability to navigate the unpredictable forces of nature. In May of 1996, Weathers joined a group led by Rob Hall, an experienced New Zealand mountaineer and the founder of Adventure Consultants. The group was aiming for the summit of Mount Everest, but Weathers, despite his experience, was not prepared for the challenges he would face on this particular ascent. He had recently undergone radial keratotomy, a surgery to correct nearsightedness. The procedure, while successful at lower altitudes, left his vision impaired at the high elevations of Everest. At 27,000 feet, Weathers' sight deteriorated further, and the world around him began to blur. He communicated his concerns to Hall, but Hall, already occupied with the other climbers, suggested that Weathers descend immediately. However, Weathers, unwilling to turn back just yet, opted to wait at the balcony, an area near 27,000 feet, just below the summit. There, Weathers stayed in isolation, as Hall, busy assisting another client, continued on toward the summit. He believed that with the sun out, his vision might improve, and he would be able to follow. But as the minutes turned to hours, it became clear that his decision to wait was becoming increasingly dangerous. Still, the weather remained calm, and he clung to hope, determined to press forward when Hall returned. Little did Weathers know that the serenity would soon be shattered. As Hall continued up the mountain, the weather shifted, and a violent storm began to build. The calm, clear skies would soon give way to snow and ice, making the ascent far more treacherous. The summit was in sight, but the mountain would soon prove to be far more unforgiving than anyone had anticipated. The mountain, for all its beauty, had begun to reveal its darker side. As Weathers waited at the balcony, the calm was abruptly broken by the onset of a fierce blizzard. The winds picked up, and snow began to fall heavily, swirling around the climbers, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The weather had turned, and the clarity of the day that had initially seemed so promising now seemed like a distant memory. Weathers, still waiting for Hall's return, was unaware that the storm was gathering strength far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Rob Hall had been helping another climber, and as the storm intensified, the group's ascent became a race against time. The higher they climbed, the more dangerous it became, and as visibility dropped, the route that had seemed so clear moments before now vanished into white. Hall's group, including Weathers, was now caught in the storm. For the climbers still making their way up, the risk of being caught at the summit with no safe route down became a very real threat. But for Weathers, the storm was far more personal. His vision had already been compromised, and the severity of the weather only added to his isolation. He was unable to see the dangers ahead, unable to know where he was or what to do next. His situation was precarious at best. Hall, recognizing the urgency of the situation, had instructed Weathers to descend, but the mountain's extreme conditions made it nearly impossible to find a safe route back. By the time Hall attempted to return to help Weathers, the storm had already engulfed them, obscuring any semblance of a clear path. The group's descent was now a slow, difficult struggle, and by the time they reached the area around 27,000 feet, it was clear that the group was lost. The point of no return had arrived. There would be no quick escape, no easy way out of the storm that now raged around them. In a matter of hours, the mountain had turned from a formidable but conquerable challenge to a relentless adversary, determined to separate the climbers from any hope of safety. Weathers and his group, once full of hope and ambition, now faced an uncertain fate. At this moment, the survivors were faced with a stark choice: continue to fight through the storm, or accept the inevitable. As the climbers huddled together, the realization began to set in that their battle for survival had truly begun. The storm raged relentlessly, its fury trapping climbers high on Mount Everest slopes. Seaborn Beck Weathers, though severely impaired by blindness and fatigue, was not one to surrender easily. His body was battered by exhaustion, the cold seeping into every limb. But it was the unrelenting mental struggle that was perhaps the most brutal. As the hours passed, time itself seemed to blur. The wind howled in every direction, and the world around him dissolved into a sea of white, with no markers to distinguish where the path ended and the void began. Weathers was not alone in his predicament. He and several other climbers were caught in the storm after Hall, their leader, had become separated from them. The plan had been to descend together once it became clear that the summit was unreachable, but the worsening conditions forced each climber into a state of survival mode, focused more on their immediate needs than on finding any semblance of order. With each passing hour, Weathers' physical state deteriorated. His eyesight, already compromised, had now become irrelevant. He was blind, unable to see the shape of the mountain or the faces of his fellow climbers. His only sense of orientation came from his memory of the path and the brief glimpses of the mountain that he had seen before his vision faltered. But the storm disoriented him further, and his mental state began to erode with each wave of cold, with each icy gust that sent his body shivering uncontrollably. The other climbers, similarly disoriented, had no choice but to press forward. For the most part, the group was trying to descend, in the hope of finding Camp 4, but the storm had erased all sense of direction. Hours passed, each one colder and more desperate than the last. For Weathers, it was a matter of moving forward, driven by the bare instinct to survive. Every step was a monumental effort, a battle to overcome the physical and psychological barriers that Everest had erected. The cold had already begun to take its toll on the climbers' bodies. For Weathers, the frostbite crept in slowly at first, a subtle numbness that would soon transform into a searing pain. His hands, now stiff and unresponsive, made it difficult for him to grip the rope or keep his balance. His fingers were already frozen, and his face, exposed to the relentless wind, was beginning to turn a deep shade of purple. His nose, once warm and alive, was now frozen solid, and his cheeks, too, were becoming hard and brittle. It was a slow, insidious process, each moment worsening the climber's chances of survival. By this time, Weathers was separated from the rest of the group. The others had managed to continue descending, but the storm made it impossible for them to reach him. Weathers was left behind, alone in the heart of the storm. His body was exhausted, his mind barely clinging to any rational thought. Yet, something deep within him refused to give up. Even as the temperature dropped and his limbs went numb, he continued to drag himself forward. It was an act of pure willpower, as he stumbled through the darkness, unsure if he was even heading in the right direction. As the night wore on, his situation grew even more dire. Without shelter, food, or water, he was left exposed to the elements. His clothing, once a defense against the cold, was now inadequate against the intensity of the storm. His body, depleted of energy and warmth, began to shut down. The frostbite continued to spread, and his body began to lose feeling. Yet, somehow, he managed to keep moving, driven by the faint hope that he would reach Camp 4 or be found by another climber. His memory of the path, once clear, became more of a dream than a reality. Each step felt like an eternity, and the mountain itself seemed to mock him, its slopes indifferent to the suffering of those who dared to climb it. Weathers was, in many ways, already on the verge of death, his body shutting down in the extreme cold. But there was still a part of him that refused to succumb. It was the part of him that had pushed through depression for years, the part of him that had sought solace in physical activity and the challenge of mountaineering. It was a primal will to survive, one that ignored the impossible odds and pressed on, step by painful step. As Weathers continued his struggle, the storm began to abate, if only slightly. The winds died down, and the snow lessened, giving him a brief moment of clarity. Yet, his condition had reached the point where he was unable to call for help. His voice, weak from exhaustion, could not be heard over the howling winds. His body, ravaged by frostbite and dehydration, was failing him. Somehow, through sheer determination, Weathers reached a point where he could rest, though he remained on the brink of collapse. His body was so cold that his limbs felt as if they belonged to someone else. His breathing was shallow, and his mind was clouded with delirium. In that moment, as he lay there, he was caught between two worlds, the physical world, where his body was slowly shutting down, and the mental world, where his mind fought to keep him alive. But even as he lay there, teetering on the edge of survival, he would not give up. There was still a spark inside him, a small flame that refused to be extinguished. His body was broken, but his spirit was not. The storm that had been relentlessly battering the climbers slowly began to subside, but its aftermath left nothing but confusion and disarray. Seaborn Beck Weathers was still lying in the snow, barely conscious, unable to move or speak. His body had been ravaged by the extreme cold, his fingers frozen beyond recognition, and his face disfigured by frostbite. The climbers who had been with him earlier had left, unable to provide further help, convinced that he was dead. In the chaos of the storm, it had been difficult for anyone to know who had been lost and who remained. Weathers had slipped into a hypothermic coma, and his body had entered a state where his vital signs were nearly imperceptible. His pulse was weak, his body rigid with the cold. The others who had descended assumed that he, like others who had been abandoned in the storm, was gone. The decision to leave him behind was not made lightly, but in the face of overwhelming conditions, survival instinct took precedence over any hope of rescue. Weathers had been left to die alone on the mountain, his body immobilized by frostbite and the crushing cold. He was no longer aware of time or place, his mind clouded by the intense cold and the ravages of his condition. He had been abandoned in the storm, not out of malice, but because his situation seemed hopeless. Yet, in the bleakest of moments, when all hope seemed lost, something remarkable happened. The human body, under extreme stress, is capable of incredible resilience. Weathers, who had been written off as another victim of the mountain, suddenly began to stir. It was faint at first, just a small twitch, a slight movement of his limbs, but it was enough to signal that he was still alive. His mind, though clouded, began to emerge from the fog of hypothermia, and the battle for survival resumed. The night that followed was one of isolation and suffering. Weathers was unable to call out or signal for help, his voice swallowed by the winds and his body too weak to move. The feeling of being trapped on the mountain, with no clear way down and no one to help, pressed down on him. But as the hours passed, something kept him going. The will to survive, though fragile and uncertain, remained. It was a quiet persistence, not born of any grand hope, but simply the drive to keep living despite all odds. In the silence of the night, as Weathers lay frozen and alone, his survival seemed like a cruel joke. Yet, in the depths of despair, there remained a thread of life, a quiet, unspoken determination to make it through. His body was barely functioning, but something deep within him refused to let go, and that refusal to give up, no matter how faint, was what would define the final chapter of his struggle. The hours dragged on, the storm weakening, but the damage to Seaborn Beck Weathers' body had been severe. He lay on the icy slopes of Everest, his body frozen, disfigured by frostbite, and his energy nearly spent. His hands, once dexterous and strong, had stiffened into frozen masses of tissue, nearly unrecognizable. His nose, once a feature of warmth, had turned black with frostbite. Yet, against all medical expectations, when morning light finally broke through the remaining clouds, Weathers showed signs of life. By now the rest of the climbers had descended, and the decision to leave Weathers behind had been made. His condition was so dire that his fellow climbers believed he would not survive the night. They had left him with no expectation of seeing him alive again. His body, already stiffening, seemed destined to be another casualty of the mountain. But as the storm cleared, a figure emerged from the darkness. To the astonishment of those who had been searching for him, Weathers was alive, barely but alive. He had somehow survived the night, despite the brutal cold that should have claimed his life hours before. His body was still in a near comatose state, but his eyes flickered open, and he began to move, albeit with great difficulty. For those who found him, the sight was nothing short of miraculous. His condition was beyond what they had imagined. His fingers, once used to grasp ropes and tools, were frozen and lifeless. His nose, too, was severely damaged, and his skin appeared to be in the early stages of necrosis. Despite this, Weathers had defied the odds, and his survival was something that no one could have anticipated. The first signs of movement were slow, hesitant, his body fighting against the overwhelming cold, frostbite, and the exhaustion of days spent trapped on the mountain. Yet, in his disoriented state, he managed to rise from the snow and began to stagger, each step a monumental effort. He was barely able to move his limbs, but something, perhaps sheer will, pushed him to keep going. In the midst of his near-death state, there was a glimmer of resolve. Weathers, though in extreme pain, and his body ravaged by the freezing temperatures, refused to surrender. His survival instincts were overpowering. Even with his frost-bitten limbs, his body in shock, and no hope for immediate help, Weathers kept going. His survival against such odds was not immediate triumph, but it marked a turning point. He had defied the expectations of those around him, and the mountain which had claimed so many before him had not claimed him yet. As he staggered down the path, assisted by his fellow climbers, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. Despite everything, despite being left for dead, Seaborn Beck Weathers had managed to survive another night alone on Everest. Seaborn Beck Weathers' survival was nothing short of extraordinary, but the reality of his condition was as grim as the battle he had just endured. Despite the fact that he had managed to walk, if only for a short distance, after his hypothermic coma, it was clear that his journey was far from over. The extreme frostbite that had set in over the course of the storm had taken its toll on his body. His fingers, toes, and nose were severely damaged, and his survival was now a fight for his life in a different form. Weathers' condition was so severe that it was unclear how much longer he would survive in his current state. His fingers were frozen beyond repair, and his nose, once disfigured by frostbite, was now at risk of being lost entirely. The climbers who found him at dawn had assumed the worst. His limbs were so stiff, so lifeless, that they did not think he would survive. But as Weathers began to show signs of awareness, the group shifted into rescue mode. They helped him move, although his steps were slow and deliberate. His body had become a stranger to him, frozen, exhausted, and on the edge of collapse. The climbers began the long descent from the higher camps to a lower, safer area, where a helicopter could perform the first-ever high-altitude medical evacuation from Mount Everest. It was an operation fraught with difficulty, with only a small window of opportunity for the helicopter to safely reach the climbers. Every moment counted, and it became a race against time. Weathers' condition was deteriorating, but the mere fact that he was still alive provided a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the odds could be defied once more. Once he was evacuated by helicopter from the Western CWM, the severity of his injuries became all too clear. His frostbitten hands, once vital for climbing, were beyond saving. Surgeons would later be forced to amputate all 4 fingers on his left hand, and part of his right arm, which was amputated halfway between the elbow and wrist. His nose was also amputated, and would need to be reconstructed using tissue from his ear and forehead. Weathers faced not only the physical scars of the ordeal, but also the emotional and psychological weight of the trauma he had experienced. Recovery was a long and painful process. In the weeks that followed, Weathers underwent multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy. The road to rehabilitation was not an easy one, but his determination never wavered. He had survived what most would consider an impossible ordeal, and although the physical toll was great, his spirit remained unbroken. The process of reconstructing his body and his life had just begun. Through it all, Weathers remained steadfast. His story of survival on Everest had captured the attention of the world, but it was the quiet resilience of his recovery that would define him moving forward. He would never return to Everest, but in a sense the mountain had left an indelible mark on him, both in terms of the scars he carried and the lessons he had learned about survival, perseverance, and the power of the human spirit. Seaborn Beck Weathers' survival story became one of the most remarkable of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, but its significance stretches beyond the events of those fateful days. The mountain that had nearly claimed his life also taught him and the world important lessons about human endurance, resilience, and the limits of the body and mind in extreme conditions. Weathers had survived not because of his physical strength alone, but because of an unyielding determination, one that defied the brutal expectations of nature and those who had assumed he would not make it. In the days following his return from Everest, Weathers' story was told around the world, becoming a testament to the will to survive in the face of overwhelming adversity. But for Weathers himself, it was not about the triumph of survival. It was about the quiet journey of recovery, rebuilding, and coming to terms with what had happened. His injuries were severe, and the physical toll was impossible to ignore. The amputations were a permanent reminder of his encounter with the mountain, but they also became symbols of his persistence and his refusal to surrender, even when the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against him. His recovery was slow and painful, and it forced him to confront not only his physical limitations, but also the emotional and psychological aftermath of his ordeal. Weathers later wrote about his experience in his autobiographical book, Left for Dead: My Journey Home from Everest, where he reflected on the mental and emotional aspects of his journey. In it, he detailed not only the physical battle of survival, but also the profound impact the disaster had on his relationships, particularly with his wife and children. He sought to reconcile his experience with his life before and after Everest, understanding that survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The true meaning of his survival, then, lies in the quiet endurance of the human spirit. Mount Everest, with all its beauty and danger, had given Weathers a second chance, a chance to reevaluate his life, to rebuild what had been broken, and to find meaning in an experience that could have easily been his end. His story is one of quiet perseverance, and in its quiet ending, it leaves us with a reminder of how fragile and precious life can be, and how even in the face of death, survival is not always about victory, but about the relentless will to keep moving forward.